All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So hello everyone and welcome to the MassCap Training Center's webinar, What We All Need to Know About Poverty in Massachusetts. And this webinar is going to go into the new report, Obstacles on the Road to Opportunity, Finding a Way Forward, which was written by the Mass Budget and Policy Center, or Mass Budget, and commissioned by MassCap. My name is Jess Benedetto. I'm MassCap's Director of Training and Performance Management. And MassCap is a statewide association of Massachusetts' 23 community action agencies. We run the MassCap Training Center, which offers training and resources to enhance the ability of each agency to serve its clients, develop its staff and board, improve operations, expand capacity, and comply with funder requirements. So today, I'm very pleased to welcome our presenter, Nancy Wagman. Nancy is the Kids Count Director at Mass Budget, and prior to joining Mass Budget, Nancy worked at Massachusetts Senate Post-Audit and Oversight Bureau. She's also been a policy and program analyst at the State Department of Public Health, a WIC program director, a human services agency planner, and a special education advocate. We also have joining us MassCap's Executive Director, Joe Diamond. But before I hand it over to Joe and Nancy, I'm going to just provide a few tips about today's webinar to help everything run smoothly. Okay, so you should have been prompted to choose your audio option, choosing either your computer microphone and speakers or to switch to a phone call. And if you're using the phone, you just have to enter the audio pin you received. If you're using a headset, you might need to click the drop-down menu under microphone and select internal mic. For best viewing of the webinar, you should expand your screen to full screen using the square box in the top right-hand corner of your window. You should see your GoToWebinar control panel located at the top right corner of your screen. All attendees will be muted during the webinar. You should use the questions box or the chat box in your control panel if you do have a question or comment. And if the box is collapsed, you can expand it by clicking the arrow next to questions or chat. You should see a drop-down menu within the chat box that allows you to choose whether you want your question to be directed to everybody on today's webinar or just to the panelist and organizer. We'll address questions and comments at the end of the webinar, so you can just type them as we go, or you can wait until we get to the question slide at the end. If you do have any issues, first try closing and relaunching the webinar, and if that doesn't work and you're still having any trouble, you can go ahead and feel free to email me at jessbenedetto@masscap.org. So before we hear from Nancy, I just wanted to turn it over to MassCap Executive Director Joe Diamond. Hi, Joe.
Hi, thanks, Jess, and thanks everybody for joining the webinar. And it's my pleasure to get things started and provide some background and context. I won't take that long, but it's about where we've come and where we're headed. MassCap is, as you know, the association of the 23 community action agencies, as Jess noted, and these are agencies that were founded over 50 years ago as part of the Great Society programs to address and ultimately eliminate poverty. We are very proud and pleased to be able to work with Mass Budget. This report that Nancy will be summarizing today is actually the third in the series, and it updates the one that was produced in 2014. We believe, as the federally mandated anti-poverty network in the state, that it's incumbent on us to bring the information that's in this report about poverty, about the people that we serve, and about ways to address poverty and inequality in Massachusetts. We feel it's incumbent on us to bring that information forward, to shed light on it, and to start conversations about it, to look not only at why and how the programs that we run have worked, but also what we can do in terms of policies and programs and practices to continue to improve how we serve people and help people across the state of Massachusetts in addressing inequality. This report was followed up on after it was published in May with a series of forums, a series of conversations, if you will, in Boston, Lawrence, Quincy, Worcester, Springfield, and Williamstown in Western Mass. And again, our way of continuing this conversation and learning locally about the people that we serve, but also how in local contexts we can continue to move forward. We can continue on the road to opportunity. The information that we provided in the report and will be provided today is important for a variety of audiences, for the people that we serve, for allied organizations, for elected and appointed officials at all levels, but critically, it's also important for the people that work in community action agencies. We know that the people that work in community action agencies are motivated and inspired by their devotion to the mission. But at the same time, we also know that an understanding of the history of community action is very important to that work, and important to the inspiration behind it. But also information is really critical. So we firmly believe that providing this updated information about the nature of poverty in Massachusetts and how we address it and can continue to address it is so important to bring to all the people who work in community action and to allied organizations and anybody who works with vulnerable individuals and families. This is also a prelude to some continued training that we will do with people who work directly with the folks that we work with, people in our agencies who can help with some advocacy training for people living with low incomes. So without any further ado, I just wanted to thank folks again for being on the line and to ask Nancy Wagman to join us. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate being invited to participate in this webinar with you, and thanks to all of you who have signed on. If you are unfamiliar with MassBudget, I'll just briefly let you know that we are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit public policy research group. We focus on state budget, tax policy, economic issues, particularly as they affect low-income and moderate-income folks in Massachusetts. We are also the Kids Count organization for Massachusetts, which uses data to influence policy and try to improve the well-being of kids. And I think that this partnership between MassBudget and MassCap in developing this report for MassCap and then publicizing it and promoting it across the Commonwealth has been really valuable for both of us, and I'm very glad to share highlights from this report today. Now, the report itself can be found on MassCap's website, on the MassBudget website, which is massbudget.org. You go to the Kids Count page on our website and the report is right there. And I will say this presentation isn't exactly the report. The report has a lot more detail than I'll be able to share with you today, and I also have more updated data than was in the report back in May. But I hope that the webinar today will encourage you to want to take a look and dive a little deeper into the report itself. So this is the cover of the report. As you can see, it's Obstacles on the Road to Opportunity, Finding a Way Forward. And today's today's webinar will have 4 parts. First, we'll start with some history and context. We'll then get a chance to talk about policies and the impact of policy. When we think about obstacles on the road to opportunity, we want to think about what works to remove those obstacles, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, at the end, I want to highlight some emerging roadblocks on the road to opportunity, some new challenges that have emerged, are emerging, that we need to consider. So what is the promise of opportunity? What is this promise offered by this road? Well, first of all, I think you all know this promise, that kids should be born into safe, stable homes in safe and well-resourced communities, that they should have access to high-quality, affordable health care, including behavioral health care, oral health care, that kids should have access to a great education from their earliest days until they're ready to pave their own path into adulthood. Families should have well-paying, stable jobs that allow them not just to make ends meet, but also to be able to put something aside for the future. And we all know that this is how we ensure that every child has the best chance and the brightest future. And this is how we ensure our best way forward as a Commonwealth. So what does this road to opportunity look like? Well, I'll draw you a picture, and we'll make this sort of a historical picture to start. Here's a picture, and it's going to be a graph. And this graph is going to draw a picture of what we know as the post-World War II boom. Along the bottom of this graph, you can see we have years, 1948 to 1973. That's, about the period we think of when we think of the post-World War II boom. And what we're going to measure is growth. So if something has grown 100% over these years, it just means it's doubled. So here's a picture. This is productivity growth during this period from 1948 to 1973. Now these are national data because that's all that we have available. A little later on in this presentation, I'll be able to share some state level data. But let's look at national productivity growth, and you can see that during this period, productivity, which is technically for the economists among you, output per worker hour, productivity has essentially doubled over this period. Now there's some wiggles here and there, but you can easily see the trend that productivity has grown. Now what does this mean? Now for simplicity's sake, let's say we're going to call productivity growth, let's call it a proxy, a substitute or sort of a picture of growth in the economy. So during this period, what you can see is that economic growth was strong and consistent. Here's another part of our picture. This is the picture of growth in what's called compensation. And compensation technically is non-supervisory wages and benefits. And for simplicity's sake here, let's just think of this as growth in what's going into workers' pockets during this period of time. Now, what's so striking to me during this post-World War II period in this picture is how tightly these two lines grew together. So what I take from this picture is that after World War II, the US economy and wages for many working people grew together. In other words, the economic benefits of growth in production were benefiting workers in the form of their wages. And let's take a look at what this really means. So what we've done is every year we line everybody up by their income and we divide them into groups and see what's happening to incomes across the income distribution in, again, national data. And what we can see here is folks at the bottom of the income spectrum, those with the lowest wages, their incomes grew during this period. Wiggles, of course, but you can see the general trend that during this period for families with lower incomes, those at the bottom fifth of the income distribution, their incomes even more than doubled. Folks in the middle of the income spectrum, the people who had median incomes, their incomes grew as well, just at about at the same rate as income growth for those with lower incomes. Finally, let's take a look at income growth during this period for those at the very top of the income distribution. This is the top 5% of incomes, and you can see, interestingly, that their incomes grew at about the same rate. All three, whether your incomes were at the bottom, the middle, or at the top, during this post-World War II boom, everybody's incomes were growing. So as wages grew, incomes grew for working people at all income levels. Now I'm going to show you another picture from the post-World War II boom. I love this picture. It's an ad from Ford Motor Company from 1950. And what it says is, now thousands own 2 fine cars. And what I think is so great about this picture as an illustration of the doubling of incomes during this period is the implication is, well, maybe you used to be able to own 1 car. Now you can own 2 cars. So the idea is that there's this promise of prosperity for anyone with access to a good job. I'm going to show you another picture from around this time. It's a little bit earlier. This one's actually from 1930s, 1940s. This is going to be a picture of Quincy. Right here, this is a map of Quincy. I'm going to show you a few other maps like this. This is a map of Brockton. This is a map of Haverhill. This is a map of Holyoke. This is a map of Chicopee. and this is a map of Boston. Now, these are all maps created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a federal entity in the mid-1930s. So these maps were created a little bit earlier, but as I'll be explaining, they're relevant for this post-World War II boom. Now, during this period in the mid to late 1930s, early 40s, this federal agency, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, sent out mortgage brokers, real estate appraisers, and other sort of bankers to map and describe their communities. Neighborhoods were described, outlined, and color-coded: blue, green, yellow, and red. And if you've ever heard the term redlining, this is where that term comes from. Certain neighborhoods were outlined and colored in red. And these neighborhoods, the color-coded neighborhoods were graded A, B, C, D, and the red neighborhoods were graded D, and they were described as hazardous neighborhoods for banks to offer mortgages or to make business loans. So I wanted to make sure you saw all of these maps so that you would understand how widespread this practice was. About 250 cities across the country were mapped this way. These were the only maps for this period I could find for Massachusetts cities. It's possible others were, but those maps have not been digitized and made available at this time. So I want to reiterate the point that this was a federal entity that was going out and mapping and describing these neighborhoods in order to affect their policies in offering mortgages or making business loans. This is one of the reports for a neighborhood in Boston described as hazardous for lending. There were reports that went along with these neighborhood descriptions. And a hazardous neighborhood was typically a neighborhood where working people, immigrants, and people of color lived. And the influence of these neighborhood categorizations has lasted for decades. And in fact, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis last summer published a report describing the decades-long influence of this color coding of neighborhoods, particularly those color-coded yellow and red. So to be clear, federal policy and practice stated that in these red-lined neighborhoods, banks and mortgage brokers should not lend money, meaning that access to the opportunity created by this growing economy would not be made available to people who lived in these neighborhoods. Now, this is the cover of a book that goes into a lot of other practices as well and policies during this period. I don't have time to go into them now, but the point is, again, that the post-World War II economic boom did not touch all communities equally. There was deep poverty affecting many communities in rural America as farming methods and industries changed. And while there was access to generous veterans benefits, such as subsidized higher education, home loans, job training, and small business support, brought this newfound, new and growing post-World War II prosperity to many, these benefits were not even equally available to all veterans, particularly African American veterans. So, to recap where we are in this history and context, we have a booming post-war economy providing an improving standard of living and increasing incomes for those with access to good jobs and opportunity. At the same time, we have barriers keeping this opportunity, keeping some people from getting access to these opportunities. So as we move through the 1950s and early 1960s, the civil rights movement pushes forward even farther the conversation about unequal access to opportunity in this country. And then in 1964, Lyndon Johnson makes his first State of the Union address. In that address, he said, "This administration declares unconditional war on poverty in America. The program I shall propose will emphasize this cooperative approach to help the 1/5 of all American families with incomes too small to even meet their basic needs. Our chief weapons in a more pinpointed attack will be better schools and better health and better homes and better training and better job opportunities. President Johnson at that time recognized this conflict between growing opportunity for some and barriers to opportunity for others. So during the War on Poverty, here's a list here. I'm not going to go through them. You can take a look at a wide variety of the kinds of legislation that was passed during this time. I've highlighted the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. This picture here is at the signing of that act on August 20th. It was a beautiful day. And what President Johnson said at the time he signed the Economic Opportunity Act, which was really central to the War on Poverty. He says, "Today, for the first time in all the history of the human race, a great nation is able to make and is willing to make a commitment to eradicate poverty among its people." So this was the true declaration of the War on Poverty. And how was it going to get implemented? Well, I think you know part of how it was implemented. A centerpiece of the War on Poverty was creating a network of community-based initiatives to address poverty. Right here, these are the 23 community action agencies that were created during the War on Poverty explicitly to implement the programs created and to address poverty in their communities. So we've declared a war on poverty, and I guess the first question we want to ask ourselves is, did it work? So what I'm going to show you next are census data from the first decade of the War on Poverty. This is data about poverty in the United States and poverty in Massachusetts. And what you can see is right away a drop in poverty. Poverty is cut by 1/3, both nationally and in the Commonwealth. So right away from the start, we see a significant drop in poverty, coincident with the declaration of the War on Poverty. So these are total poverty numbers. The next chart I'm going to show you will be child poverty rates. And you should know that I don't have child poverty rates for Massachusetts for 1960, in part because we didn't even measure it back before the War on Poverty started. The War on Poverty also started a national conversation about measuring poverty. So here's the child poverty rate. For the blue line is the US child poverty rate. The orange line is the Massachusetts child poverty rate. As I say, we don't have data for 1960 for Massachusetts, but let's just assume that it follows about the same trend as the US rate. And what we can see right here very clearly is that drop in the first decade. But something's kind of interesting going on here, because these lines aren't dropping after that. So we see a drop in the beginning, and then poverty rate levels off. So what's going on? I mean, why has poverty persisted since the implementation of the War on Poverty? So there's one possibility. Maybe the initiatives created during the War on Poverty just didn't work. So interestingly, we have a pretty powerful tool created by the US Census Bureau that allows us to measure the impact of publicly funded programs on poverty. It's called the Supplemental Poverty Measure. This slide here kind of gives a quick comparison between how the official poverty measure works and the supplemental poverty measure works. The details aren't important other than the way the supplemental poverty measure is built. It allows us to layer on bit by bit each of the public programs and see how that additional layer affects the supplemental poverty measure, so we can see whether these programs have an impact on poverty. And what we find is that, in fact, now these are Massachusetts data, that SNAP or food stamps, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, housing assistance, tax credits, and other kinds of public benefits largely created during the war on poverty, in fact, have cut poverty in half in Massachusetts. 920,000 people have been kept out of poverty thanks to these programs. And the same is for kids. Child poverty has been cut in half thanks to these programs. About 200,000 kids in Massachusetts are kept out of poverty thanks to these programs. Okay, so I think we're getting some information here that helps us understand that maybe the problem isn't that these programs don't work. We have these data that show us that these programs are in fact keeping people out of poverty. So what's going on? If the problem isn't that the publicly supported programs created during the war on poverty don't work, well, why has poverty persisted? So I'm going to take you back to a familiar chart. You've seen this before. This is there's the line for productivity from 1948 to 1973. Here's the compensation line. You've seen this before, 1948 to 1973. They're growing steadily and together. Let's just take these data out to the future, out to current day. And what we see here is that wiggles, of course, but productivity is continuing to grow from the post-World War II period through today. We see, pretty steady growth in productivity. The economy, in other words, the economy is growing. And let's see what's happening with compensation during this period. And what you can see is that all of a sudden, compensation stops keeping pace with growth in productivity. In other words, what's going into people's pockets isn't growing as fast as the economy is growing. So while the economy has grown, the economic benefit created by growing productivity has not found its way into workers' pockets. Now, this is a dramatic change from the prior period. So what happened? In fact, there were policies during this period that broke the connection between economic growth and wage growth. For example, national economic policies stopped emphasizing wage growth. Congress allowed the real value of the minimum wage to decline, and that has a real impact, particularly on lower wage workers. Congress and the courts weakened protections for workers and unions. Agencies responsible for enforcing existing worker protections were starved for resources, and the architects of macroeconomic policy focused more on fighting inflation than on supporting full employment. So to be clear, these were policy choices that changed the relationship between economic growth and wage growth for many. And let's look again at what this looks like for people's incomes. And now we have Massachusetts data for our incomes, and what we can see from 1980 to the present. Again, we line everybody up by income, divide them into groups. Incomes for those at the bottom fifth, 20th percent. Incomes over this period have been flat. Now, all of these numbers are always adjusted for inflation. So incomes at the bottom have stagnated. They have been flat. How about incomes in the middle? Median incomes also have stagnated, have stayed completely flat during this period. So wages, incomes have stagnated for folks at the middle of the income distribution. And remember, the economy as measured by productivity is still growing strong during this period, but wages aren't growing for most people. So where is all of that economic benefit created by the growing economy going? So now let's look and see what is happening for folks at the top of the income distribution. And what we see here is that incomes at the top 1% of income, are growing just fine. Now we can see where the economic benefit during this period went. It went disproportionately to the folks at the very top of the income distribution. This is, again, this is very significantly different from what we saw during the post-World War II boom, when for those who were working, income growth was shared across the income distribution. So there's a direct link between stagnant wages, incomes that don't stretch far enough, and poverty. Poverty is mostly a story about low-wage work. Most low-income families include at least one working adult, as you can see from the data in this chart. There are a lot of numbers here. You can focus on the one that I've circled, but you can see that most low-income families include at least one working adult. So let's look at wages, incomes, poverty by the numbers. We have the federal minimum wage, which is still $7.25. Full-time work at the federal minimum wage is just $14.05. But let's look at the Massachusetts minimum wage. It's just gone up to $12 an hour. Full-time work at the Massachusetts minimum wage is $24,000 a year. These are the official poverty levels. For a two-person family, just under $17,000. For a four-person family, full-time work at the minimum wage does not bring you out of poverty. So I can't emphasize this enough, this link between wages, incomes, and poverty. So low wage growth and other policies have led to disparities in family incomes. We've talked before about unequal access to opportunity. Unequal access to opportunity shows up in these kinds of disparities in family incomes. And you can see as well that there are wide disparities in income across all of our communities of Massachusetts. This map shows you the median income for families with children. The statewide median income for families with children is about $96,000 a year. However, in the median income for families with children in Springfield is $31,000. In Worcester, it's $48,000. In Boston, it's $52,000. In Wellesley, it's over $250,000 a year. So we have wide disparities in income across our communities. And I will mention these data and these maps, you can find them at the Kids Count Data Center, and the URL for that is datacenter.kidscount.org. And these data are also in the report. Now, policies have also created wide disparities in wealth. These data are from a report called The Color of Wealth in Boston by the Federal Reserve Bank. You may have seen them in the policy in the columns that the Boston Globe published on race. And when you think about it, where does most wealth come from? First of all, wealth is typically passed from generation to generation. People's wealth often comes from a business, and most typically, in fact, from their homes. Now, remember what we talked about with neighborhoods that were redlined, where people who lived in redline neighborhoods were denied access to mortgages or loans to build businesses. So when barriers to opportunity were allowed to persist for people in those communities, it shows up through the generations in these enormous disparities in wealth, where a white household median net worth is $247,000 or a black household median net worth is $8. And these are data for sort of it's sort of eastern Massachusetts. So let's be clear about one thing. The economic future of the state relies on the well-being of all of the children in the Commonwealth, and all means all. We can't let ourselves leave any child behind. And you see, even though we have, let's say, a relatively low poverty rate for kids compared to other states, there are enormous disparities. The poverty rate for white kids is 6%. For Latinx or Hispanic kids, it's one out of every 3 kids is below the official poverty rate in Massachusetts. Here are data for child poverty across the Commonwealth. Children under poverty, 100% at the 100% poverty level. As I say, the official poverty rate is 14-15%. Slightly different measures here. But however, the child poverty rate in Springfield is 44%. In Worcester, it's 31%. In Boston, it's 30%, and in Wellesley, it's 5%. So there's huge variation across the Commonwealth. And even children who live in families that are near poor have trouble making ends meet. So this is data for kids under 200% of poverty, twice the poverty rate. It's about 29% statewide. However, 71% of kids in Springfield are poor or near poor. 53% in Worcester, half the kids in Boston, 7% in Wellesley. There's huge variation across the Commonwealth, but just don't forget 71% of kids in Springfield are in families that are poor or near poor. So what is inadequate incomes? What's the impact of this? Well, we know about the high cost of housing. Inadequate incomes make it hard to keep a roof overhead. 1 in 4 households in Massachusetts pay half their income on rent. Renters paying half or more of their income on rent is across the Commonwealth. This is an issue. I'm not going to go through these numbers. These are for selected cities in Massachusetts. You can see, as many as 1 in 3 renters are paying half their income or more on rent. Inadequate food incomes also make it hard to keep enough food on the table. 1 in 10 households in Massachusetts is food insecure. Fortunately, food insecurity in Massachusetts is actually not as widespread as in most other states, but that gives me small comfort given that 1 in 10 households is food insecure, meaning has trouble making sure that they have enough food on the table all the time. So poverty is a story of low-wage work and poorly resourced communities. Well, and so how do we remove obstacles to opportunity, or how do we provide access for people to circumvent those obstacles? And you know what? We know what works, and we know how to do it because we've done this before. We know to remove those obstacles that state and federal investments remove obstacles to opportunity in poorly resourced communities. We know that there are policies that help families make ends meet. We know there are policies that help working people balance the demands of work and family. We know there are policies that help make work pay, and policies that help improve access to work. Well-resourced communities, we can invest in lowering the high cost of housing. 220,000 people in Massachusetts are kept out of poverty by housing assistance programs alone. These are programs like the Mass Rental Voucher Program or Section 8 housing vouchers. We can invest in well-resourced communities and investing in education, from early childhood education and care, K-12 education that provides the best quality education for every kid in every school, in every city and town in the Commonwealth. Supports that help kids keep on track towards the right next step, whether it's voc-ed, whether it's affordable higher education, whatever the right next step is for every child. These are the kinds of investments we can make to provide well-resourced communities, to lower obstacles to opportunity across the Commonwealth. We can make investments that help low-income families make ends meet. For example, help families keep warm when it's cold. The fuel assistance program is a crucial benefit to help low-income families make ends meet during our cold winter months. Investments that help put food on the table, such as the WIC program, SNAP or food stamps, or the school meals programs that are crucial for helping kids stay well-fed and be ready to learn, or cash assistance programs that help low-income families have enough to get by during tough times. And we know how to do it because we've had victories that help make work pay. We've increased the minimum wage, which will benefit 22% of kids, 19% of working parents, and the minimum wage went up to $12 the beginning of this year and will work its way up to $15 an hour. We've had victories that help make work pay by doubling the earned income tax credit, and the VITA sites, as operated by the CAP agencies, are incredibly important in making sure that low-income families have access to this very successful benefit. The earned income tax credit benefits in Massachusetts 12% of all tax filers, but you might be interested to know that 38% of tax filers in Lawrence have benefited get the earned income tax credit, 33% in Springfield, 22% of tax filers in Worcester get the earned income tax credit, 16% in Boston. It is a benefit that benefits low-income taxpayers in every single city and town in the Commonwealth. We've had victories to help workers balance the demands of work and family. We had victories on earned paid sick time and paid family and medical leave. But there's more to do. We know that we need more to improve access to work, whether it's better access to childcare so that workers don't have to be worried about their kids being safe during the day when they're off at work, and transportation, whether it's public transit or transit, making sure our roads are safe, or providing transit out in our more rural communities. These are challenges to opportunity that are still ahead of us. Furthermore, there are obstacles to opportunity because sometimes the bridge to opportunity doesn't stretch quite far enough. For example, sometimes you have programs that are underfunded. Their funding doesn't keep up with inflation. There may be waiting lists, childcare, Section 8. We know how long the waiting lists are for those programs. And sometimes there are potholes on the road to opportunity. Sometimes they're called cliffs I call them potholes, as somebody's income rises, they might lose a benefit, and the value of the benefit is larger than the increase in their wages. So these are challenges that we need to address through policy, recognizing that sometimes our bridge to opportunity isn't going quite far enough. And before I end, I want to talk a little bit about some new challenges and emerging roadblocks that we all have to be paying attention to. Federal policies have significant impacts on families and communities. For example, the federal 2017 tax legislation cut $1.9 trillion, that's trillion with a T, in tax cuts for the wealthiest and for corporations. And that's $1.9 trillion over 10 years getting pulled out of the federal budget. Why does this matter? This matters because 1 out of every $4 in our state budget is a federal dollar. So it matters because of federal programs, and also these tax cuts could have a very significant impact on our state budget. If, in order to balance the federal budget, because this huge hole has been created, Congress says the only way to balance the federal budget is to cut federal funding for programs, that could have create a very significant hole in our state budget as well. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention changes to immigration policy. The federal government recently proposed a change in their definition of what's called a public charge. This policy has had already what's known as a chilling effect, meaning that because of the climate around immigration policy in this country, people who are eligible for federal benefits are feeling nervous about applying for and getting those benefits. We call that the chilling effect. So even people who aren't affected directly by a policy feel nervous about federal taking advantage of federal benefits for which they're eligible. And so that we're very concerned about that. And the 2020 census is coming up next year, 2020. And again, federal immigration policy and the proposal to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census could have a very significant impact on immigrants who live in what are called hard immigrants and those who live in what are called hard to count communities, which could affect the reliability and accuracy of our census counts. And census counts themselves have a direct impact on substantial federal funding coming to Massachusetts. Funding for special education, for Title I, which is direct support for low-income students in our public schools, funding for Head Start, for the WIC program, child care funds, funds that come for social services block grant for foster care, the community development block grant fund. All of these are federal funds that come to Massachusetts directly based on census counts. So if our census count is inaccurate because people are nervous about filling out the census form, there's substantial federal funding at stake. And this picture right here, in case you're curious, includes the Massachusetts census. This was from the first census ever taken in 1790, and you can see the Massachusetts total population was 378,787 people. So finally, there's, the shutdown may or may not, the second shutdown may or may not happen, but this instability and insecurity about federal funding and whether it's going to be affected by the shutdown is, of course, something that we're all concerned about. So here are our takeaways on finding a way forward. Policies do and can and continue to have long-lasting impacts. Poverty is an outcome of low-wage work and under-resourced communities. We can pass policies that improve work and that invest in our communities. What happens in Washington matters in Massachusetts, and we know we all want to live in a Commonwealth where every family has the best chance at their brightest future. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn this over to see if we have any questions or comments from the audience. Please, again, use the questions or the chat box. Okay, I don't see any questions or comments, which is fine. But you can feel free to you can feel free to email us, and I'm going to turn this over to Jess again.
All right, great. Thank you, Nancy. Sorry, I had myself muted there for a minute. I was looking at the questions in chat, and it doesn't, as Nancy said, it doesn't look like we have anything. But if anybody does have questions, you can go ahead and email them to me at jessbenedetto@masscap.org on the screen there. And I'm happy to see what we can do to answer those or reach back out to Nancy and get you connected. So before we close out, again, I just want to thank Nancy so much for all of this great information and all of the really hard work that went into creating this report. And I believe Joe Diamond, MassCap's Executive Director, has a few closing words for you. Before I hand it over to Joe, I just also wanted to let you know we'll be sending out a quick survey evaluation about today's webinar. So I'll be sending that out by email, and we really appreciate any feedback that we can get so we can improve the future offerings of the MTC. You can also check out masscap.org to see any other trainings we have coming up, and stay tuned to the MTC newsletter for updates. Thanks so much, and I'm going to hand it over to Joe.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks very much, and also to Nancy, thank you as well for the presentation. I've heard the presentation a few times, if not more, and I look forward to hearing it again. There's so much rich information in there, important information that I know is very beneficial. And by the way, to folks on the line or the webinar, this has been recorded, so if you want to refresh some of the information, please feel free to refer to it once we've completed the rendering of the recording. I wanted to just say a few words about the presentation and then make the link to the public policies that we're promoting now and in the future. The partnership we have with MassBudget is very much appreciated. The information that is provided in this report and was provided by Nancy really provides this sort of the underpinnings and reinforces how we move forward in a variety of areas, including the public policies that we promote. So we've got 5 that I wanted to note quickly, and we have a more detailed summary of these at our website. The first item is a piece of legislation which would authorize resources, flexible resources for community action agencies. It would update the way community action agencies are described in state law in terms of our holistic approach and the work we do in communities, and would provide for other opportunities within those communities. In particular, not only would it provide some flexible funding to community action agencies, but it would also create an innovative or fund for innovation in terms of addressing inequality. Further, for this current fiscal year, we are asking the legislature, we actually asked the governor and asking the legislature for a supplemental resource for fuel assistance that we're seeking to be allocated as soon as possible. The governor put in a supplemental budget, $11 million for fuel assistance, and we're asking the legislature to build on that so that soon, very soon, $30 million will be allocated for fuel assistance to help 160,000 households who have challenges covering the cost of fuel assistance, whether it's covering the cost of home heating oil, gas, or electricity. Fuel assistance resource has dropped over the years and was cut again this year, and so we see it as a very critical program to support. For FY20, certainly there are a few other priorities that we are pursuing in a few areas. The first area is early education and care, and we are seeking within a coalition, working within a coalition, to increase early education and care teacher salaries, sort of quality through compensation. We want to make sure that we've got stable workforces to help low-income families with early education and care, including Head Start. Head Start is also a priority. We want to increase the state line item, which supplements the federal resources that come in for Head Start. And as well, we want to strengthen a referral program that helps people make connections to early education and care resources, that is early education and care opportunities for their children. It's the Child Care Resource and Referral Program, which we're seeking to increase resources for as well. Nancy also mentioned the Earned Income Tax Credit and Voluntary Tax Assistance sites. We are working with the coalition to further expand the Earned Income Tax Credit to go to 50% of the federal credit. It's been increased from 15% to 30% in the past few years, and we're hoping to cause that to go higher. We are also seeking resources for VITA sites. There are 80 across the state. The community action agencies run close to half of those, and the resources would support this very low cost but high return activity, allowing people, giving low income taxpayers an opportunity to access the Earned Income Tax Credit and other tax credits. As well, we are seeking support from sort of within the context of creating a foundation for economic opportunity. We're seeking support and working with the coalition to support a line item, increase a line item that would help unaccompanied youth avoid homelessness. It's a prevention approach to homelessness. So those are the areas that we are pursuing. And again, the background, the context, and the reasons we are working on these areas of activity, these areas of priority, stem from the information in the report. So thank you very much for being on the line. And again, thank you, Nancy, and I will turn it back over to Jess.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. So that concludes today's webinar. Again, you can visit masscap.org for up-to-date listings on our trainings and other information about MassCap, and feel free to email me with any questions. And again, just keep an eye out for the email with a link to just a short survey about today's webinar. Your feedback is really important to us and helps us improve the offerings of the MTC in the future. So with that, we conclude our webinar. And again, we were recording this webinar, so we will have that recording available on the MassCap website sometime soon. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.